So the other question we were going to raise is, how does sexual fantasy benefit our sexual health? Well, in my opinion, and from my experience, sexual fantasy can demonstrate your cognitive and physical creativity and awareness. Now, this is very, very important, right? Like, I want you to think about cognitive functioning altogether. And a lot of research, I'm sure you've read it. I see it on Instagram. I see it pop up on my Apple News about how there are things that people can do as they age to keep them more mentally aware or to keep their mental cognitions really sharp. And these are exercises. They could be games, they could be reading, they could be learning language, it could be a number of different things. Fantasy works the same way when it comes to our sexual desire and drive and our sexual creativity. It shows that you're being creative. It shows that you're still thinking and you're still functioning as a sexual being, and that area of your life is still very much alive. So it's good to have sexual fantasies, whether you're single or whether you are with a partner. It is good for both couples and individuals to have sexual fantasies and to be able to talk about their sexual fantasies. Now, I know a lot of you listening so far, this is where I've lost you, right? Like, you're still like, yeah, I do have these sexual fantasies. Yeah, it is nice that when I have these sexual fantasies, yeah, I can really get off thinking about these sexual fantasies. Oh, it's okay for me to think about sexual fantasies with my partner. Like, you're all okay until I mentioned talking about your sexual fantasies, because for a lot of people, talking about their sexual fantasies is very intimidating. Now, I have to think about this sometimes because, I make a living talking about sex, right? Whether it's in therapy, doing podcasts like this, doing interviews, doing other. Okay, I talk about sex all the time. So for me, the discussion is not so taboo or awkward. Like, I sometimes have to remember that for a lot of people, having these types of discussions are rather difficult. And I cannot relate. Unfortunately, I cannot relate. So I often have to step back and think when a client comes in and say they've been in a relationship for a while and they have certain fantasies and they want to talk to their partner about these fantasies. And I'm like, well, go have a talk with them, right? And they're like, oh my goodness, I cannot talk. And I'm like, you've been with this person for 5 years, 7 years, whatever the case may be, and you cannot talk to them about your sexual fantasies, right? And some of you are nodding. You're going, Dr. Jones, that's absolutely right. I would be terrified if my partner knew the things that I fantasize about, because you worry what the other person will say, what they'll think, what they'll do. And so I've thought about this. And one of the things I think is very important is that both you and your partner or your potential partner recognize what a fantasy, that it doesn't necessarily say anything about who you are as a person. Because that's really what it boils down to, right? Like, you're worried about how your partner will react to what your fantasy is and what they'll assume about you. But fantasy doesn't necessarily, is not indicative of who you are as a person, right? If you fantasize about choking someone during sex or hitting them during sex, it does not mean that you are a violent person. If you have a rape fantasy, which I have to tell you, a lot of clients and a lot of people that I've talked to and a lot of surveys have shown that this happens to be one of the most popular fantasies, is a rape fantasy. But it doesn't mean that the person actually wants to be violently or physically or sexually assaulted. Nor does it mean that they have been violently, physically, or sexually assaulted in the past. It's simply a fantasy of theirs.